Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we necessarily look and think outside of the box in order to thrive. This week, it's a great pleasure to be joined once again by Dr. Zach Bush from Virginia in the United States. Dr. Zach Bush is a triple board certified physician and internationally recognized educator on the intersection of the microbiome with human health and disease and our food production systems. Dr. Zach Bush, a very warm Dr. Bush, a very warm welcome back to the show.
So glad to be back with you, Nigel. Thank you. And thank you, everybody listening in to join this conversation.
Fantastic. So the purpose of the show today is to try to give all of you listeners some guidance on how we can adjust our lifestyles to support the foundations of health. What can we really do? What can we put into practice? So, Dr. Bush, would you kick us off with giving us some kind of definition, your definition of actually what health is? What are we trying to achieve?
Fantastic. Yeah. So health really comes down to your resilience within an environment, right? And so the aging process is one in which the rate of healing starts to be outstripped by the rate of injury. And so in a nutshell, your resilience, your health, your youth, or vice versa, your aging is a simple ratio of rate of repair to the rate of injury. And so that simple ratio is really what I zero in on in a clinic all the time. If somebody comes in with acne or cancer, it doesn't really matter. In this simplification of the universe of health and healing and disease, you start to just see this simple ratio. If the person is showing up with a dysfunction, whether that be the simple aging process or something like cancer, there's been this mismatch in this simple ratio. And so that's kind of the fundamental concept of health, which is what is your resilience? What is your rate of repair? And how does it relate to the ecology or the environment that you're within?
Wonderful. So given that's actually what health is, what are the foundations that support that? Obviously you're coming from the perspective of somebody who knows a lot about gut health. Can you explain to us the foundations, what really underpins that condition of health?
This universe is changing so quickly now. 10 years ago, nobody in cancer world or the greater world of health was talking about the gut in any kind of grand scheme. Now you can't pick up any consumer journal or for that matter magazines at your grocery store or peer-reviewed journal science that isn't pointing back to the gut. And so we've had this huge 10-year kind of paradigm shift that's happened with our understanding of how health as a fundamental concept can no longer be seen as a human experience. And so there's no such thing as an isolated human health. Health is really a description of our interaction with this greater ecology around us. And this term microbiome has been thrown around to near exhaustion now with a lot of misperception within it. The bacteria get all the credit, right? We think of probiotics and things like this. It turns out that is a fraction of the truth and the possibility of this human and health capacity. What we're talking about when we talk about microbiome is a vast ecosystem of non-human cells that encompass the fungal kingdom, the parasites, the viruses, and ultimately the bacteria as well. But the bacteria are very much outnumbered by many of these other kingdoms. We think that there's somewhere around probably 20 to 40,000 species of bacteria that are critical for that human biology to work within. But that 20 to 40,000 species of bacteria is in the context of 300,000 species of known parasites that are in and around that human experience around the globe. Contrast that 300,000 with the fungi, which is at 5 million species of fungi. So then we go to the viruses, and we're in the billions of variants of those viruses. The viruses are now conservatively estimated to be somewhere around 10 to the 31 viruses on the planet. That's one with 31 zeros after it. We don't have a name for a number that huge. And so these are numbers that are so astronomical. That 10 to the 31, to put it in perspective of maybe the universe, that's 10,000 times more viruses than are stars in the entire universe. And so that 10 to the 31 number is mind-blowing, astronomical number. And so this microbiome is more a definition of biology itself on the planet, and humans now, would represent a tiny, tiny fraction there within. We are one species within those, millions and millions of species out there. And so that should give us a real quick readjustment on our perception, this kind of narcissistic belief about who we are and what we're dominating here. So that's something of concern to me, is that our medical world continues to see human health and disease as a human problem, while the micro ecosystem and all the peer-reviewed literature out there is starting to say, we got to focus on the microbiome. But even 10 years into this journey, medical science and physicians are looking at this so myopically. We're so zeroed down on one species or a few species of bacteria, and that just does not do justice to this greater system. And so my passion and where we focus our attention with our laboratory here at Biomic Sciences is really looking at the communication network, this wireless system of communication between the species, to understand how is it that this huge microbiology around us goes on to program us or prepare us for a responsive, regenerative, resilient human experience.
So maybe you could give us your definition of gut health. Obviously, you've alluded to how important not only the human microbiome is, but the whole interaction with the environment. So can you just define for us a healthy gut, Dr. Bush, before we go on and maybe have a look at some of the things we can do to assure that we achieve a healthy gut?
Wonderful. This is a critical question again, because again, we start to just think about the gut in this microbiome world, whereas really the gut is a structural event that's critical to human biology, in that it is the biggest barrier between the outside world and that human biologic system. The gut membrane covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. It's the largest surface area that interacts with the outside world, obviously, and it's 1 cell layer thick. That cell layer is 50 microns in diameter, which is half the width of a human hair. And so imagine a human hair cut in half on the bias there, and you realize, or rather on the length of the hair, and you realize just how thin this cellophane-like cover is that's protecting you from the outside world. But it's not just protection, it's actually an intelligent membrane that is supposed to keep out the bad stuff and absorb all of the critical nutrients and the water from your food and liquid systems. And so that gut health definition begins with this intelligent barrier that is a gatekeeper. It's not just like a brick wall. It's an intelligent gatekeeper that's going to open up and allow the right stuff through, and it's going to be a barrier to the unwanted stuff. So that intelligent gatekeeper system, in its combination with or in its communication with that complex microbiome that we just defined, is really the experience of gut health. Sitting right behind that cellophane-like layer is about 60 to 70% of the volume of your immune system, and it's probably 80 to 90% of the generation of antibodies to the outside world. And so you've got 80% of your antibodies cranking out from the gut lining, and that's your response to whatever sneaks through that gut barrier. And so gut health comes down to microbiome, the intelligent gatekeeper system, and your immune reactivity and sensitivity and intelligence that sits behind there. As a group, I would say that's going to constitute the vast majority of your definition of the gut and gut health. Others, though, including myself, would point to important other structures within this system, which would include the liver and its whole vascular system. And so vascular and hepatic and kidney are kind of the continuation of that system in my mind. And so you've got these barrier events throughout the body that are supposed to determine what you absorb, how you process it in the liver, how that gets repackaged, sent out to your body, how toxins are packaged in the liver to protect the rest of the system, and then ultimately sent to the kidney for the kidney to expel whatever is not wanted in the body quickly.
Great stuff. And obviously you pointed out there detoxification. We live in an increasingly toxic world, as I'm sure many people can appreciate. So that there's a key ingredient there. How do we detoxify? So maybe we can come on to that. The obvious things that we can do that spring to mind to support our gut health and the systems that you've outlined there beautifully is obviously to avoid using antibiotics, and some of the listeners will be familiar with avoiding C-sections and the need to breastfeed and all of these sorts of things that you've spoken of before, Dr. Bush. But could we maybe sort of look into the whole category and give a broad strokes approach? How could we best support our the health of our microbiome and our gut health through diet? You know, in I know it's a big topic, diet, but could you give us a few pointers that would give us, you know, set anybody off on the right track who's inquiring?
Yeah, through all human history, food preservation and the seasonal consumption of food really came down to fermentation, and we lost that skill set and kind of focus as of kind of the 1940s and 50s as widespread refrigeration became available, and so we got lazy as in our food preparation methods, and we lost this magic of fermentation. The reason why that's such a detrimental loss is because when microbes are allowed time with a food, such as your sauerkraut with that cabbage, or your sour Reuben with the turnip, or your kvass with the beets, when you take a vegetable, either root vegetable or otherwise, and you allow a microbial diverse population to work on that, you get an enormous amount of interesting breakdown products or metabolites in that, and you liberate those into bioavailable nutrients that you couldn't achieve in the human gut, because the passage of your cabbage, when you eat fresh cabbage, for example, will be about 90 minutes from stem to stern. So that'll go from your stomach all the way to colon in about a 90-minute period. That's not enough time to ferment down all of those independent nutrients in one fell swoop. Some of those will be left behind and will break down over the course of a few more hours. But if you leave a sauerkraut going for 3 weeks and then consume that, you've got a completely different nutrient delivery system. And of course, you're getting the intelligence of that microbial metabolite system. And that's where we focus our attention as a lab again, is how does communication happen between bacterial species and maybe bacteria in the human species? And interestingly, it comes down to these metabolites. When a single species starts to work on a nutrient profile, it will start to make these little carbon molecules that are capable of communication, capable of transfer of electrons. This kind of wireless network, like your cell phone works over, starts to function. And so I really see fermented foods as this critical mechanism of enriching not just the nutrients, but also these metabolites that would help coordinate the bigger systems in response to those nutrients. So I think, number one, get fermentation back into your life. There's some fads out there right now. Kombucha is a big fad right now that I'm not a huge fan of, because it leaves a ton of sugar in there, and I don't like what that does to the microbiome. And so I prefer things like your fermented vegetables that are allowed to really ferment for weeks or months. The master of the ferments is definitely miso. And so the miso pastes out there, the white bean, which would be a soybean base, or the red bean, which is non-soy, there's no metabolites of the soybean left by the time you get a miso paste. You have a very unique food that's neither soybean or red bean by that time. The typical miso is fermented for 1 to 7 years. If you go to Japan, it's all 7-year fermentation. They have fancy miso that they don't really export to the world because they consider that like one of their national secrets. In the U.S., we can get 1 to 3 year ferments, and 3 years are actually very recent on the market. Whole Foods never had a 3-year ferment until like just the last few months or year here in the States. So we've got this new kind of burgeoning I think emphasis, fortunately, moving in our understanding of the importance of these fermented foods. The interesting thing about bacteria is they can digest anything. They can digest radioactive material, the toxins that are in our food system, herbicides, pesticides, plastics. They are so good at breaking down products if they're given time. And so that's the magic, I think, of fermentation, is that you're giving the microbes time to really work through the toxicity of that food. Something like your root vegetables like beets are extremely high in herbicides and pesticides because of their root location in the growing process. So you can see very high residues there. And your cruciferous vegetables like kale and Brussels sprouts, which are two of my favorite superfoods out there, can carry an enormous amount of herbicide and pesticide. And so if you don't have access to organic food systems, then ferment those foods that are going to be high in toxicity. And so your beets, your kale, all of these can be your Brussels sprouts. Shave those Brussels sprouts fresh, don't cook them. Put them in a saltwater brine and let those ferment for a couple weeks, and you've got a totally different experience for your gut microbiome and the rest, as those antimicrobial properties of those herbicides and pesticides can be diminished. If you don't have access to these things and you don't have time to make them, then a simple one is just an unfiltered organic apple cider vinegar. The microbial intelligence in apple cider vinegar and start to break down some of those products in your gut as you digest food following that. So using apple cider vinegar as kind of a go-to as a salad dressing and things like that can be a helpful resource in a toxic food system. We then specialize in making food supplements or dietary supplements out of the fossil soils that carry all these carbon metabolites. And so going beyond the fermentation process, now we go back 60 million years and extract a huge variety of these metabolites, over millions and millions of different varieties, these made by millions and millions of different species of microbes that lived in the soil 60 million years ago. 55 million years ago, interestingly, we had a huge collapse of global soils, and that's what led to the mass extinction of dinosaurs as we know it and things like this, was that an annihilation of that top layer of the soils on the Earth that happened from probably a volcanic event, but most people think it was probably an asteroid that hit the planet and covered the Earth in this layer of dust that you can find anywhere in the world at that layer of archaeologic record. And so that death of the topsoil, I think, was the moment that we really have never recovered to. We've never recovered topsoils like existed in the dinosaur era. The ferns that grew, they grow to the size of a house and things like this. There was a biologic intensity in the soil, a biologic, vitality on planet Earth that has never been recovered to its full potential. And then, of course, over the last 200 years of kind of scaled agriculture and chemical agriculture in the last 50 years especially has further decimated that ecosystem of microbial intelligence in our soils, which has vastly depleted our nutrient density and bioavailability of those nutrients within the foods that we're consuming. Now, a lot of the chemicals that we spray these foods with, corn, soybean, alfalfa, wheat, all of these foods that are sprayed directly with Roundup and other herbicides and pesticides like 2,4-D and all these other ones that are emerging. The German Bayer company that now owns Monsanto and Roundup made that purchase because they have their own approved GMO crop that's been approved in the EU and the US. It's called Liberty Link, and it's a terrifying chemical that blocks the ability of our food to make critical amino acids for human fertility and other processes. So I'm amazed by what we're allowing to happen as consumers, largely because we're kept so ignorant to the systems because our governments have been so slow to inform us of what they're approving and what the implications are of these approvals. And so we're in this slippery slope of collapsing nutrient density on the planet, and it's obviously mirroring directly the collapse of human health that we've seen over the last 25, 30 years. 1985 was a whole different world than 2015 in our calculations, and it's always a bummer that we're always like 4 years behind on our public health statistics because the last 4 years has been the steepest climb in a lot of these chronic diseases affecting our children and otherwise. In the U.S., our most recent data kind of coming out from 2018 is starting to look like we're probably at 52% of our children with a chronic disease now. And so that's unbelievable statistics, unbelievable on so many levels. But to compare that, in 1960s, 4% of our entire population, cradle to grave, had a chronic disease. So we've gone from 4% of the whole population to 52% of just our children alone with a chronic disease diagnosis. And so my stump that I'm, traveling the world talking about is, if you're not in the United States, please look what we've done to ourselves. Please look what's happened to our public health and don't repeat that, because we have exported our chemical agriculture to the world now. And some of the most vulnerable developing economies in the world are now adopting our practices of farming and leaving behind thousands of years of brilliant, successful, and effective peasant farming, and we're putting all those small families out of business, and you're scaling to the large scale of farming. Today, only about 30% of food consumed on the planet is produced in large scale agriculture. But we're going to lose that 70% that's still done by peasant farmers. We're going to lose that over the next decade if we don't rapidly change this atmosphere and economy for farmers globally. And so I'm on a rampage with my nonprofit now to get out there, get a training system in place for farmers to reconsolidate not only their knowledge base and consumer knowledge of why they need that small family farm, non-scaled, regenerative agriculture. And we need to pair it with the economic incentives and protection for those farmers. And so that's what we're doing with our nonprofit, education and financial superstructure for this agricultural system globally. Because if we don't do that as a human population, we really are looking at the end of our species over the next 7 to 8 decades.
Well, from what you were saying there, obviously things like eating organic is going to be important as well. Obviously that doesn't exclude all toxicity from food, but it's a massive step in the right direction. So I imagine you're also going to say that vegetables and some fruits obviously are very important for the fiber content, for the microbiome, for all those microbes to actually chew on, as it were. Would you agree?
Yeah, so you started the fermented foods, and the fiber there is also interesting. In the fermented foods, you keep the fiber there. That's one of the detriments or the downsides of juicing. With juicing, you get a high nutrient density without fiber. This cranks up the glycemic index of that juice, and so you can get a very high sugar spike from these things when you pull the fiber out. And so that concerns me a bit. I think that unfortunately there's such poor nutrient density in our foods that there is some logic to combining juicing with a fiber-rich experience. And so I think it's in every area of lifestyle nutrition, it's going to come back to variety is king. And so a variety of raw foods, cooked foods, steamed foods, long-term fermented foods, that's where you start to really maximize your potential to get the nutrients you need as a human being. Diversity is going to always rule. And I think that's really comes down to your fruits and vegetables again. Eating seasonally is something we've lost because we can ship vegetables and fruit all year long from around the world. In the United States, it's not hard to get avocados and mangoes in the middle of January in our winter. That never happened before. And so the human has developed our ability to nutrient densify and pull nutrients out of our environment in seasonal eating for 200,000 years. And suddenly we go to this monotony of, well, it's the same thing, season by season and all that. And that concerns me. So recall that as you move into the fall coming up here, remember to start to get more of those fall season crops, which are going to be some of those cruciferous greens, things like kale, Brussels sprouts, and then moving into the root vegetables, your sweet potatoes, your beets, your turnips. These are critical pieces. And so doing, kind of a light roasted vegetable dish in the winter with your turnips, beets, onions, and things like that are going to be a good way to eat seasonally within the context of that, and start to phase out some of those, tropical fruits and blueberries and everything else. The high glycemic index fruits in the wintertime, probably a bad idea. Yep. When you're getting your higher glycemic index, you want your vitamin D cranked up, which is a very important steroid hormone, which would be very active during your spring and summer months. That's when you're ready for those higher glycemic index experiences. Mm-hmm. And so recalling that seasonality and phasing out strawberries and some of those high GI, watermelon, another really high glycemic index fruit. So phasing those out during the winter, bringing them back in seasonally in spring and summer is really intelligent.
Yeah. And I gather that strawberries are meant to be one of the most heavily toxic crops, aren't they, of those sort of winter fruits that we're eating out of season. Great stuff. So we've had a good look at what we can eat there, bringing in the fermented foods, obviously eating seasonally, eating organic, and avoiding the sugar. I'm sure you'd agree with avoiding most processed food, which of course is stacked with sugar, as well as a whole bunch of other things that are undesirable to eat. Maybe we could have a look at another category of drinking enough and hydration. It's obviously quite an important component of health. With respect to gut health, how do you approach that whole topic? I mean, is it just a question of sticking a certain number of glasses of water down your neck? Can you give us a brief overview of guidance if there are any specific areas that you think people need to be aware of?
Yeah, like the gut microbiome, I would argue that we're even less mature in the science around hydration. it's so interesting that we've been taught to do almost everything wrong. We don't exercise correctly. We don't sleep correctly. We don't breathe correctly. We certainly don't walk correctly. Just all the fundamentals of being human. We got away from our original biology through technology, really. And so the technology, as simple as a shoe, screwed up the way in which we walk and things like that. And so in the same way, water has become very confusing for the body. Water was never supposed to be a molecularly dense system. Water is supposed to be these tiny little effervescent quantum physics molecules that are vibrating at a very high vibration and allow for really dynamic movement across cell membranes into the cell. And there, ultimately, water is your ultimate kind of astringent or cleaner. It will go inside the cell and clean out all of the metabolites and break down toxins that your body makes in its normal day of activity and get those out to the kidney. In the same way, if toxins that are man-made get into the system, water is really good at helping move that through the system, ultimately out through the kidney and the rest. And so, interestingly, that high vibration water that we get from like a nature's stream, if you're drinking from a high mountain stream, you get these very tiny clumps of water that are very vibrationally active. You're down to maybe 12 to 15 of these tiny little H2O molecules that are kind of clumped together. Coming out of your typical tap water, you're more up around 70 to 90 of these H2O molecules at a relatively low vibrational state clumped together. And now you have to have enough energy at the cell level to try to peel off those H2Os from the big clumps so that you can get those through the cell membrane and hydrate the inside of the cell. One of the things that we're seeing, this accelerated aging, where our children under the age of 12 are showing up with diseases, everything from, horrible cancers all the way to endocrine dysfunction, premature puberty and polycystic ovarian syndrome and, endocrine disruptors. A lot of this is coming down for the inability of these children to get water inside the cell. So they're getting dehydrated intracellularly. And interestingly, they can drink that tap water all day long. And what starts to happen is they'll actually start to dehydrate the cell with all of this kind of dead water, where the water will start to pull electrolytes and other osmolar kind of proteins and things like that into these abnormal ratios across the cell membrane, because you got all this free water sitting outside of the cell and it can't get inside the cell well, and so it screws up the balance of electrolytes and other things. And so in the end, fresh water in a dead system like that is probably not going to be our key to hydration. And so we work a lot with getting water back into a vibrant state. And right now, most of this is a research environment where we haven't figured out how to scale that to municipal water yet. We haven't figured out how to get these municipal water systems to get back into a natural state of delivery. It may not be possible. We're not sure. But the key here is really thinking about motion within the water. And so a very low-tech tool that I use for getting water into the kind of more living thing is just these filters that you can put on at the end of your water system right before your sink or whatnot, or they even have pitchers that you can just fill with water, and then as you pour them into your glass, but they look like a series of like golf balls inside of the filter that just forces the water into a vortex, and it causes collision of the water molecules as it pours around a spherical thing. Picture a stream full of stream rocks. You're familiar with those pebbles that you would see in any stream. They've become smooth at the texture level, but if you microscopically look at them, they have all these tiny little dimples that force not just big vortices, but tiny little vortices within the water. And that vortex type environment keeps this high vibration state. It even detoxes the water. It can kill bacteria. It can keep the water free of amoeba and other things that might cause gastrointestinal upset. And so it's just this natural system of keeping water vibrant and clean for consumption. And so these filters may play a role in the future if we can figure out how to scale those up. I think they're never going to match nature, but they're moving us towards that potential.
Do you think it's worth specifically avoiding municipal drinking water and tap water? We're a lot of people now are very familiar with the fact that tap water is laden with antibiotics, with glyphosate, with birth control pills, a whole cocktail of things not in high concentrations, but a lot of things are actually in our drinking tap water. Do you think is it an essential that people should consider filtering their tap water these days?
It's essential that you filter. It really is. Yeah. If you're on a municipal water system, you need at least carbon filtration, to try to pull out some of the stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of the small molecules, the endocrine disruptors in there and stuff like that are very hard to get out of there. The plastics being a good example of that. Reverse osmosis and distilled waters get a lot of focus. Deionized waters get a lot of attention. The problem with those is that once you put it through those intense, systems of filtration, you've really dropped the energy within the water. And so those are the ones that you need to add some electrolyte back, and you need to get them into a vortex. You need to get that water spinning again before you consume it, because those are very low energy. It's clean, but now very low energy. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as just, filtration. I think the cheapest, most effective bang for the buck is just carbon filtration at this point, and then think about even a little bit of electrolyte put back into the carbon filtered water. Birth control and statin drugs are the top drugs that are pertinent to our water systems in the U.S. Birth control pills, of course, carrying estrogen, progesterone. Both for males and females, this is a very bad idea. Taking exogenous oral estrogen, progesterone, even in micro amounts, can screw up receptors in your gut lining and your liver as to kind of what your management of your endocrine system looks like. It can make you prone to, everything from cardiovascular disease to blood clots and strokes and everything else, all the way to cancers. And so that low-grade endocrine disruption that we see with birth control being so prevalent in our water systems is a major concern to me. And then the statin drugs are also very concerning, because even at these micro amounts, they screw up metabolism. They slow our metabolic function in muscle and other critical tissues like the brain. And so we start to lose this metabolic reservoir of function as we kind of poison the water system with these drugs that disrupt the ability of the liver to make these important cholesterol, nutrients, and stuff for the body.
Right.
So filtration critical, but one thing that I want to remind you of is very little of the water you drink, no matter how complicated and fancy you get with your systems, doesn't represent the majority of the water that's going to be biologically active and available in your body. Much of that actually comes from your fresh vegetables. And so it's very important to remember a cucumber is probably your best hydrating event. So eating a fresh cucumber, especially if you throw a little bit of lemon or vinegar in there, you're going to have a big hydration event there. It's going to be way more effective than drinking a glass of water as far as getting water inside your cells. And so I really encourage people to think about these snack packs where you're kind of snacking through the day on veggies to kind of keep hydrated through that process. There's a lot of herbs that are out there that are very effective at improving the hydration capacity as well. Yerba mate is interesting. It's got a high caffeine level, but it seems to also have this ability to pull water in. That the brand yerba mate that's out there has not been tested there, but the plant itself has been shown. Maybe it has, not to my knowledge, but the plant itself has been shown to have some very interesting, effects on the body's ability to biologically kind of integrate the water that herb has touched. And so I think that's where we're going to go in the future of our understanding of water is going to be less about filtration and all this and more understanding how the plant kingdom makes water available to us. It's obviously very good at doing it. If you look at the way that a tree is able to pull water up into a 60 or 160 foot canopy from the ground without any pump system, it's really, plants have figured out how to move water across cell structures. And so they're masterful at it. And ultimately that's what we need to mimic, is that plant-like capacity for pulling water out of vast systems and then channeling them against gravity up inside cellular systems.
Do you think there's a lot of electrolyte supplements on the market? There's swathes of them. Most of them have got hideous sugar additives or stuff like that. Do you think there's much point in adding electrolytes to that, or do you think you can get, from a glass of filtered water, if you put in a little bit of Himalayan salt and maybe some lemon, like you say, is there something the ordinary person can do or that's as good as these electrolytes supplements?
Yeah, your best go-to tool out there. Himalayan salt's a step in the right direction. You've got about 24 to 26 mineral salts available in there. So, but in contrast to that is the gray sea salt. So something like Celtic sea salt, those ones have more closer to 64 mineral varieties in there. And so my preference is, a quarter teaspoon or a splash of that gray sea salt into most of your water. I am a fan of doing variations. You don't have to do electrolytes into every glass of water you drink, but doing the variety again, I think has some potential health benefits to it. So not in every glass, and you want to tailor it to your own body. There's a lot of genetic variability at the kidney tubule as to how much salt your body needs and benefits from. And it's important to remember salt's not bad for us. We have to have salt. And I think salt's gotten a bad rap in our cardiovascular hypertension kind of dogma. But we now know that there's something called salt-sensitive hypertension, which means that if you don't eat enough salt, you get hypertension. If you give that person back salt, their blood pressure drops. And that's 10% of the Caucasian world genetically. And so that's a very interesting kind of relearning of this relationship that we have to water and salt as we start to realize kidney tubules can vary a lot in their needs for it. If you happen to be an excessive sweater where you sweat profusely after a little bit of exercise or no exercise and you're sitting there and suddenly you're just sweating, and particularly when you sweat, you leave a ring of salt on your, at the armpit of your t-shirt or whatever it is. If you've got salt that's visible on your clothing after sweating, you're definitely a salt waster, which means that your kidney tubules don't hold on to salt well, and you're going to really benefit and lower your blood pressure by the addition of salt in your diet there. I do like the addition of a little bit of lemon in there for a salt waster, and so there you're adding your gray sea salt and half a lemon to your 8 or 10 ounces of water to get that replenishment going. And you'll figure out how much salt you need. And really, the key is, like, if you feel like it should be saltier, then put more salt in, and then track your biology.
Yep.
Blood pressure is an easy one, but also how well are you sleeping? What's your energy level? All these kinds of, kind of what I'd call B symptoms there. Like, how do you overall feel?
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I think, again, a new and burgeoning science of what is our relationship to not just what types of electrolytes, but the availability of that electrolyte in a certain pH and osmolality. All these things need to be sorted out over time. Mm-hmm. And it's exciting. I think that, what's clear is I'm very fortunate. I've got great grandparents on both sides of my family that died at ages over 100 years old. And then I think back to their generation. My great grandfather passed away at 101 about 20 years ago now, and my great grandmother passed away about 15 years ago at 101, and so this is fascinating to see this generation that had no supplementation, no concept of herbicides, pesticides. They grew up in West Virginia coal towns and Pennsylvania. A Superfund site was my grandfather, so a great grandfather, and so these people who had really like toxic environments lived to very ripe ages. And yet we can't see the subsequent generations coming after them apparently eating and drinking a lot cleaner, not living nearly as long, and having chronic disease crop up much younger. And I think it has to do with the microbiome here. My great-grandparents were able to be very resilient in very toxic environments because we hadn't started to attack the microbiome on the level that we did following the 1970s. By the 1970s, we were just dumping antibiotic into our human environment, but it's also when we really advented large-scale agricultural antibiotics, and those agricultural antibiotics have gone logarithmic in usage in our pork, poultry, and cattle, kind of in that order, I think, over the last 30 years. And so as we've annihilated the microbiome of our food systems, both through herbicides and pesticides in our soils and crops, as well as direct use in our animals, we start to get the downstream of that, and we become less resilient. And so, again, microbiome is king here, I think. And as we start to be friendlier to our microbiome in our larger scheme of ag, I don't think we need to panic as much about the toxicity that is going to be residual to our chemical agricultural and chemical medical systems that have so gone off the path and strayed so far from truth.
Well, that's quite encouraging because there's ubiquitous toxicity, there's ubiquitous EMFs, of course. So there are a lot of onslaughts, and it's quite encouraging to hear you being so optimistic that provided we look after our gut, which I think there's sufficient information for the average listener to assimilate and be able to do just that. So that's very, very encouraging. What about the category of sleep? Is there anything specific about us? Obviously, we need sufficient sleep. It's a key component of a healthy lifestyle. Is there anything around the issue of gut health, maybe not sleeping in EMF fields or something? I mean, what do we need to know in broad strokes for the fundamentals of health with regards to our sleep?
Yeah, I think, like I said, we don't do any of the fundamentals right. Nobody's really taught good sleep hygiene as we start launching into life. And by the time we're in college, we all have pretty massive sleep debts. A recent journal that I read on sleep debt in Americans, I think it was around the average American by age 55 has 20,000 hours of sleep debt. And the brain tracks sleep debt very carefully. And so by the time you're 50, 55 years old, you've missed 20,000 hours of potential sleep. This is the level of stress that we're carrying around from that lack of sleep. But how does that tie in directly to gut health is pretty darn interesting. One of the primary hormones that regulates your appetite and regulation of fuel usage is ghrelin. Ghrelin was discovered in the late 1990s, and at my University of Virginia, where I was for many years, we did a lot of pioneering research there through Dr. Thorner's lab. And the ghrelin research was showing that this interesting relationship to leptin, which is another kind of gut hormone that regulates appetite. And so ghrelin is kind of your fueling the hunger hormone, and leptin is your satiation. And so as you start to gear up towards a meal, and your body's saying you need to eat, that's ghrelin speaking. And then you eat, ghrelin drops, leptin picks up and says you've eaten, you ate enough, you're good. As we lose sleep, we start to screw up the relationship between ghrelin and leptin, and we screw up the drive and its response to your food intake, and we screw up leptin and the satiety signal, so that when you're missing sleep, you're very prone to overeating, and you're very prone to wanting a stimulant in there. Fat, salt, and sugar combinations are that ultimate nutritional stimulant, and every fast food restaurant on the planet has figured out that fat, salt, sugar combination, and they know very well. And many of us will eat fast food and be like, oh, it's so sweet. It's almost disgustingly sweet. And yet when you're tired, that's what your brain is going to go for. And so if you find yourself craving, fast food or junk food or stuff that is not ideal for you, look back over your last week and I'll bet you found yourself in a sleep deficit there. I travel all the time for work now, and that makes it very challenging. You're leaping time zones and everything else all the time. And so for a global community now, we need to work on what does it mean to reground into your time zone? What does it mean to reset these hormones? How are the mechanisms that you do that? And a lot of that comes down to sleep hygiene in those mobile environments.
When you talk about sleep hygiene, do you mean things like a cool, dark room, avoiding blue light before bedtime? Do you mean that general list of to-dos, if you like, for a good night's sleep, which we don't need to go into here? We can just reference that.
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right. Some great books out there on sleep hygiene now. I think the science is quickly developing, but a lot of it's coming down to light medicine. Like the toxicity of our light, our artificial light is brutal on sleep cycles. And so
how important is electromagnetic fields in that? And maybe we can tie that into, it's another part of people's lifestyle choices. Obviously, the mobile phone, the smartphone, is a key part of many people's very existence, you could almost say. So just on the sleep side, is it very important to sleep as isolated from EMFs as you can?
Yeah, so interestingly, this EMF toxicity issue, I think, actually ties right back into our food system, which is kind of a bizarre statement. But what we've been showing in our laboratories over the last 7 years is really this pattern in which as soon as Roundup or glyphosate containing herbicides touch the gut membrane, vascular membranes, your gut-brain barrier, your kidney tubules, they all break apart these tight junctions. And the tight junctions are there to create this kind of spot weld that's actually an intelligent, more like Velcro than a weld. It can open up and close, zipper open, zipper shut, and allow that appropriate blockage or the appropriate absorption of macronutrients from your gut lining. And so what we want to see with this kind of intelligent system from gut all the way to kidneys with your blood-brain barrier and vascular systems between is this very integral system of communication and what's needed in which compartment. When you start eating food with herbicides and pesticides, you start to break down those barriers. And right behind the tight junction is something called a gap junction, which looks like a fiber optic cable, and that's how it functions. It moves light energy from one cell to the next. It is how your body can coherently function as a single electromagnetic field. When you have intact tight junctions and gap junctions, you are extremely powerful. A cubic centimeter of mitochondria, which pack all of your cells, that cubic centimeter of mitochondrial density can produce 10,000 times more energy than the surface of the sun. And so that's a very interesting thing. That cubic centimeter by cubic centimeter, there's more energy production there in those mitochondria than nuclear activity on the surface of a solar system or on a sun or a star. With that much energy emanating through your body through these fiber optic systems, I think you're very resilient to exogenous electromagnetic field. And we see this, right? A lot of people walk around and they're like, I've got a cell phone, but it never bothers me. I sleep well. I feel pretty good. I work 80-hour week. I got a ton of energy. I work out at the gym. Like, you can't see any. In contrast, you can find people that if a cell phone is 10 feet from them, they can get a migraine. They can get triggered by these and so this is kind of our electromagnetic kind of sensitive population. So what's the difference between those two groups? Maybe there's some genetics involved. There's a lot of focus on the calcium channels right now and how that's influenced. I think sodium-potassium channel signaling is involved here, things like that. So there's probably some genetic predispositions, but I think deeper than that or more fundamental to this kind of current explosion of EMF sensitivity is certainly because there's a lot of EMF, but also because we have never been more compromised in our fiber optic system connecting our cells. Once you break those fiber optic systems, now you become very prone, I think, to this static that can happen as exogenous EMF overwhelms a single cell's capacity to create a coherent electromagnetic field.
Okay, so electromagnetic fields possibly not quite as scary as they might be considered if we attend to our health in many other areas, if we keep stacking the cards in our favor, particularly around the gut and with those tight junctions and gap junctions, as you say. That's really interesting. So with things like, let's look at avoiding toxicity. We mentioned earlier that it's an increasingly toxic world. It seems that the avoidance of toxicity, we have to be aware of the fact that we live in a toxic world. We've talked about the tap water and the EMFs. Do you have any specific tips around how to detoxify? We just have to walk out the door to be exposed by toxicity. Short of obviously we mentioned organic food and so forth. Do you have any specific tips for detoxification?
Yeah, so just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem, and then hopefully we can point to some if not immediate solutions to this, certainly short-term, medium-term solutions for our planet. Organic food is impossible to find on the planet now. Like really, clean food that has no residues of these chemicals, herbicides, pesticides in there is probably becoming impossible at this point. I'm certainly not familiar with any place that tests completely clean these days, and that's largely because glyphosate, being the most prevalent of these herbicides, which is the active ingredient in the Roundup that's become so infamous in recent year with all these lawsuits in the United States against Monsanto and now Bayer. This chemical is water soluble, as are many of these organophosphates that are in our herbicide pesticide environment. These water soluble molecules are now put into play in our soils, which of course are hit by either irrigation water or rainwater, and that then washes down into our river systems, and that water soluble molecule gets carried with it. These chemical companies got away with it for years, saying, oh, you spray Roundup and it's gone within a few hours. Well, the word gone was misperceived. We thought, oh, well, maybe it just disappears. Well, no, these chemicals can't disappear. They're very stable molecular structures, and they need to be broken down by something. But before they can be broken down, within those couple hours, they've been carried into the water table. And so water within the soils, the rain, the irrigation, all this will carry it out of the soil system and into the water, either aquifers that are now poisoned by this or our river systems. And so the river systems then will consolidate this, and so our largest water system in the United States is the Mississippi River, collects some 80% of the Roundup that we spray in this country into a single river. So by the end of the Mississippi River, which runs for the last 90 miles, runs between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana, a single state within our union, that state is now the highest rates of cancer anywhere in the developed world. We've got this 90-mile strip that we call Cancer Alley, correlating with that river. And especially in these environments, we find 75% of the air that is breathed and 75% of the rainfall in these environments is contaminated with Roundup. And so now you've got a farm, 100 miles away that says, yeah, we're totally organic, we're certified organic, we don't spray, we haven't sprayed ever, or we haven't sprayed in more than 3 years. Well, if it rained, you got Roundup on that crop. And so for this reason, for example, our wine industry in the United States, there's not a single wine in the U.S. that's testing negative for Roundup these days. And so we have just toxified our entire water cycle, which means that none of us are devoid of it. We recently did a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial with our soil supplement, and we were testing urine levels of Roundup in this population that we were running through the trial. There wasn't a single person that didn't have detectable levels of Roundup before or after the study. And so really ever present are these molecules now. And so when we say go eat organic, we're really not saying you're going to be devoid of chemical. What we're saying with eating organic is you'll get hopefully a little less of the chemicals. But more importantly, you're demanding a change in the agricultural system, right? And so that's why I think it's critical we all go and eat organic as much as possible. It's because we're creating a demand for a different farming system. If we don't create that demand as consumers, it will never happen. And so we have to be very unified in our consumer behavior to say this is how we're going to shop. This is how we're going to demand that our children have a cleaner food system in the future. Our nonprofit, which is called Farmers Footprint, is really focused on how do we go beyond organic? How do we start to get these chemicals out of the food system? And that, of course, comes back to really working with the microbiome. Microbiome, again, can break down Roundup. It can break down herbicides and pesticides. It can clear those from the soils and water systems. How are we going to do that? We need to start working with the soil and making the soil rather than the plants and the vegetables and fruits our focus. If we make the soil our focus of farmer efforts and inputs and the lack thereof, hopefully, we change the mentality of the farmer. And when you create super vibrant, healthy microecosystems, microbiome, soil supported by the fungi and mycorrhizae and all of this, you stop tilling the land. It's more important even than stopping spraying. Stop tilling, allow the fungal communities to come back in, allow this different agricultural system to set up, and within even a year, you see massive recovery of the ecosystem in those soils that have been decimated by 16, 20 years of chemical ag. 1 year of good practices can reset the system. Then within 7 years, you see massive recovery of ecosystems all the way up to the macrofauna. You see the return of eagles and the coyotes and all of the important levels of the kind of hierarchy of biology on the planet can return to that space. Mm-hmm. And so it's very exciting to me that if we were to really change to a regenerative organic system within the next 3 years, by 2035, we could be the healthiest food system that humanity has seen in thousands of years. Why? Because our soil has been degrading for thousands of years, especially in the last kind of 1,200 years. It was, I think, around the year 900 that we invented the plow, and that's when we started to screw up soil biology fundamentally. And so for the last 1,100 years, 1,200 years, we've been really destroying that ecosystem. And so we could really push nutrient density back thousands of years, not just decades, by going to a regenerative practice. And the exciting thing is this is not an expensive proposal. It actually saves the farmer money and it radically increases their income over the first 5 years. And so we can see 5x and even 10x incomes for these farmers because they eliminate all these expensive inputs, chemical fertilizers, chemical herbicides, pesticides, all of these kind of band-aids from the chemical industry. Let Mother Nature come back into the system. And of course, resilience and vibrant life is the result. And so I really believe that we are at the tipping point of human history. We will either go extinct over the next 7 decades, or we will become the healthiest and most resilient we've ever been, perhaps ever, because we've only been here 200,000 years. And the last time that we saw really, global resilient levels of soil architecture was 55 million years ago. So long before we showed up as Homo sapiens sapiens, we were devoid of the full potential of Mother Earth. I really believe we are called to a co-creative process with Mother Earth. I think we could return her through our cooperative relationship to her to vibrant levels of biology on this planet that perhaps haven't been seen in millions of years.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Let's hope that the next 70 years comes up with the results of us being healthier and not being driven to extinction. I suppose something that a lot of people can do with this importance of food and its toxicity and so forth is to grow their own. Obviously, it's not available to people with no space to do so. But it does sound like, and even not tilling the soil and so forth. But I suppose, everybody else needs to sort of focus on not poisoning themselves with fragrances and air fresheners and toxic carpets and all the paints and all that sort of stuff. What do you think about things like sunscreen, Dr. Bush? Because that's a tricky one. The sun comes out in summer. Here we are in August. Hopefully people would be sufficiently outdoor exposed to not have to suddenly slap on some sun cream, but that's always a sort of a tricky one, isn't it? Because I would hope to not ever need to put any on my children, and generally speaking we don't, but of course there could be circumstances where that's not the case. What do you think people should do, general principle wise, around things like that?
Put on clothes. So it's this awesome thing. Like I don't use sunscreen at all. I don't like sunscreen at all. I think it's really a hazardous, potential to it. There's some cleaner sunscreens that are starting to come on the market and things like that. But I'm concerned about blocking the sun's relationship to the skin. It's one of the most important endocrine events that happens is sunshine on skin. Yeah. I think it's also really important for an anti-cancer effect to get that radiation damage from the sun on a routine basis. I think that we damage, unhealthy, damaged precancerous cells with that sunshine and can eliminate those cells. So I believe that the sun is really, not only inducing an important, hormonal event with things like vitamin D and vitamin K and all kinds of interesting things that start to interplay around vitamin D, but also really this concept of, we've developed in the context of that sun for our 200,000 years, and so it's the right thing for us. Now the question is, how do you live in a balanced fashion with that sunshine? And the answer is, if you're not in the sun very often, then when you do go in the sun, take it in short doses and then, prolong your exposure over an appropriate amount of time. So if you're out for a week on a vacation, make sure that on the first day, you're only out for 15 to 20 minutes at midday, and then you cover up. Throw on that beach cover up, put on a big hat, cover up, and let that sun be a more passive kind of experience instead of that direct skin contact. Then the next day, you'll be really glad that you're not the one that's like lobster red on the beach on day 2, and you can actually, spend a little bit more time out there and ease into that. And after a week, you're spending an hour or two outside in the sun, and you're not, burning the heck out of yourself. And so you're going to dose equivalently to your skin quality. If you have very pale skin, obviously you need to take it even easier. Yeah. If you've got more Mediterranean skin or dark pigment skin, you're going to be able to be a lot more resilient to that sun. But regardless of the tint of skin, you got to ease into it. Yep. And so cover up. It's so simple. If you're going to apply something to your skin, the ones that I trust the most right now are the powdered mineral compounds. And so there's some seemingly benign ones there. But even those, I think, should be used sparingly and only on occasion, because our skin is very good at absorbing mineral, and too much unopposed mineral, not a good thing either. Yeah. And so I'm not a fan of people who are putting on sunscreen as part of their makeup routine every day. That can't be good for them. And so shutting down your ability to make vitamin D at the skin and then covering your skin in 169 different toxins is a disaster. I rail against the makeup industry all the time. I know so many of my patients and people in my audiences worldwide that are literally spending thousands of dollars a month on eating organic and supplementing and all this stuff, and then every single morning they wake up and they put 189 different synthetic chemicals on their face that are absorbed into their bloodstream over the course of their day. And so makeup is an utter disaster for human health. Yeah. And I understand, and everybody says, well, there's healthier ones coming on the market. Healthier is not, you're going for health, not slightly less toxic here. Yeah. And so please, if you're out there, women, keep in mind, men don't like makeup. Like we don't like makeup. It doesn't look good. It creates this like junk that gets on our clothes when we try to hug you. We try to kiss you, and it's all up in us, and like it doesn't smell good, it doesn't feel good. It makes your skin actually look older, not younger. We're not there for the makeup. The makeup industry, I think, came out of women's desire for an artistic expression, and now it's become a social expectation.
Absolutely.
If it was this artistic expression that came out at the big events a couple times a year, maybe as it was historically, that probably wasn't such a big deal. But now that's the daily expectation, where you're not just augmenting your eyes, you're literally covering your skin in this foundation and junk, and then your moisturizers and all this stuff, and it's a nuclear bomb.
It is, isn't it? I couldn't agree more. So what about detoxification, Dr. Bush? Do you think there's anything in things like saunas and things like that, or colonic irrigation, or the various other techniques to help us, tackle the amount of toxicity that we have in our bodies these days? What techniques do you think are worth considering?
My favorite one is sweating. If you just sweat for 10 minutes a day, just get outside, run around, do physical activity. I've got 6 acres of woods that take so much energy to maintain. In Virginia, here where I live, if you're not beating back the woods, you've got yourself a jungle on your hands before you need it. And so I love being in the humidity of Virginia, where it only takes me 3 to 4 minutes of outdoor work before I'm pouring sweat. And I'm in that, dense humidity of the summer sun, and I just love that experience, where it just feels like I am just liberating myself. And after an hour and a half of tree work and lawn work and everything else, like my body is different, and you go to sleep that night feeling exhausted and a little bit muscle overexerted, but you feel cleaner. And you take that shower at the end of that workout, and you're washing away all of those toxins that have come through your skin. Now make sure you take the shower. Now, a lot of people are using the infrared saunas and stuff to mimic that experience. That's great. If you're not outside sweating, then get yourself an infrared sauna. I think it's a powerful tool. 10 minutes of sweat there, and then shower off afterwards to make sure you're getting those chemicals off your skin. Never to exceed really 30 minutes in a sauna. Typically, you don't want to overdo that. I tend to like the saunas where your head stays out of the sauna. Heating the brain, probably not a great idea. And so, keeping that core body temperature elevating to the point of sweat and getting that infrared experience is an option. You want to make sure that you're shielded from the electromagnetic field within those electric saunas and everything else, and so make sure you've got a grounding potential, some sort of grounding pad within your sauna, so that you stay grounded throughout that sauna experience. So that's a lot of technology, a lot of complication, when you can just walk outside and sweat and get all the benefits. So I always love remembering how powerful Mother Earth is. When you're outside working, remember to slip off those boots or your shoes at the end of it. If you have to protect your feet during heavy labor, then slip them off at the end and sit there and drink lemonade and your iced tea there with your feet in the grass, and let the Mother Earth deliver that additional detoxification, which is through the electron delivery through your skin when it touches Mother Earth. And so get grounded, another very powerful tool for detoxification and anti-inflammatory potential and all of that to take effect after exertion.
Mm-hmm. What do you about things like modern dentistry in terms of toxicity? We're talking about broad stroke lifestyle choices to extend our lives. Do you think that it's important for people to examine their oral hygiene, possibly the drip feed of mercury amalgam fillings, that sort of thing? How important is that in the scale of these things that we're trying to, all these factors we're trying to juggle to achieve gut health and overall health?
Dentistry terrifies me. I think it's one of the most archaic sciences we have in the medical world. I'm somewhat relieved that mercury is no longer being used quite as abundantly in the U.S. as it has in the past, but still worldwide, mercury amalgams continue to go in. We have been warned from the manufacturers of mercury-containing amalgams since the beginning of their thing not to put these in children. And yet all of us as children got exposed to these mercury fillings. What we don't know how to do is really deal with those once they're in the mouth. We don't know if it's better to take them out, to put them in. I think there's a lot of differing opinions on that. There's some techniques where you can measure the impedance across a mercury filling to see if it's grounding out to your body. If it's not, then there's some rationale to maybe leaving that in your mouth. In general, I try to get mercury amalgams out. The problem, though, is what do we put in its place? And so most of the fillings that are now used out there are composites that include chemicals that are also neurotoxic. And so GMA and BPAs and all these weird endocrine disruptors, as well as direct neurotoxins, are in a lot of these alternative filling materials. And so the only ones that are out there that tend to be relatively clean of these only last a short amount of time. And so you end up doing multiple fillings and increasing the risk of a root canal and things like that. And I'm not a fan of root canals at all. And so, I think dentistry is infantile in its understanding of its contributions to the chemical toxicity of our bodies, and infantile in understanding what nature would do with those. What's clear is it comes back to the microbiome. As far back as Weston A. Price in the 1920s and 30s, he was a dentist, and he realized that all these developing world, kind of third world countries had no cavities, and so how is it that these seemingly starving nations and starving developing economies were so healthy with their dental hygiene? They didn't have toothbrushes, and they certainly didn't have water picks and all the other stuff that we use in these environments. And the answer was microbiome. And that was, 1930s, he figured that stuff out. And so he was using nutrition to improve the microbiome of the oral cavity. Yep. And I think that's key. And so getting things like refined wheat and sugar products out of the diet can have a huge immediate effect on your dental hygiene. We've seen with our soil supplements a marked improvement in the microbiome's relationship to the gums and elimination of gingivitis as the microbiome recovers, things like that. And so a very cool, kind of relationship, microbiome to the gums, to the teeth, all of this being interrelated. I just avoid dentists, period, which I can't really recommend to anybody else, but I just avoid them. I haven't been to a dentist in over a decade, and they terrify me for so many reasons. Number one, perhaps, is the relationship to the x-ray. Like, you go to any dentist and they're like, every year we're going to irradiate your head and your mouth so that we can take pictures of your teeth so that we can see if there's a cavity that we should shove a toxic material into. The whole thing is so backwards in its approach. And so I believe that we need non-radiation diagnostic tools to be demanded. They certainly are out there. The technologies are available where we shouldn't be irradiating children in their mouths and their brains every time we decide we need dental work. And so I really shy away from x-ray exposure. I think that there's a lot of issues in its impact on microbiome. I think that it's very likely, if not 100% sure, that we're screwing up and making you more prone to more cavities in the future by giving you a bunch of x-rays and then giving you chemical, cleanings of your teeth and, deep gum cleanings with all these chemicals and everything else. We're screwing up the microbiome with all of that. Yeah. And so I'm sure we're predisposing our children through these aggressive dental things. So find yourself a biologic dentist and hope for the best in some ways, because even biologic dentists are not equipped with all the tools that they're going to need in the future to become less toxic to our health.
True. I imagine, if we respect cause and effect, as you alluded to there, diet is the causal factor for dental oral hygiene problems, tooth decay. So that's probably the takeaway message, isn't it? Aware of time, so just a couple more questions here, Dr. Bush. Is there any? Obviously, exercise is a huge component of health, which we're not going to go into. But is there anything that we need to know about the exertion of exercise, whether it be high intensity, whether it be cardio? Are there any relationships to the microbiome and stuff that you have any insight on that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, it's kind of like the discussion around nutrition, which is variety is king. And so if you go to the gym and you do the same workout 3 times a week or every day, you're probably not getting your best bang for the buck. Get outside. Don't depend on your gym for your workout. Run a trail. You're going to breathe microbiome, and just getting out there and running or walking or hiking or doing parkour or, get out there and really work your environment. Garden instead of going to the gym. These are the key features I think that we're missing again as we've over technified our exercise experience, and we've put too much technology and too much plastic weird junk in our hands and everything else to work out. Foam has got all kinds of weird chemicals. You think of all the foam on all those handles and everything else that you're grabbing onto in a gym. All of that, or plastic is off-gassing off of all of your treadmills and all this stuff. The treadmill's heating up and it's off-gassing and plastics into the environment. You're breathing that. It's just, we have to come to terms with just how far we've strayed from nature's template for human health. And so I think, trail running, I'm a huge fan of water sports. And so I'm a terrible surfer, which means it's the best workout you can possibly have because I spend so much time paddling back through the break. And so, get outside, get exposed. A couple hours of surfing is, some of my most frustrating time, but I also, at the end of the day, know it's some of my best time spent as far as, getting that exposure to the environment. And so get outside, get out of the gym. Variety's king. Those are your keys.
Lovely. And I suppose, you'd probably agree that stress management is quite key as well, isn't it? I remember hearing some advice somewhere that before you eat, obviously there's the tradition of grace for those people who are religious. We often sit in our household and just sort of, say something thankful or appreciate the meal that's been cooked. Is there any scientific research that backs up the fact that if we're chilled out, de-stressed, all these processes occur more effectively?
100%. Yeah, we see a direct influence between the cortisol molecule, your stress hormones, and the tight junctions in your gut. And so you'll get leaky gut just through stress. And so even if you're eating organic and you're doing all these things and you're doing all the supplements, you're doing all this fancy stuff, if you're sitting down eating that meal in a stressful environment where you haven't detoxed your day, you've got leaky gut and you're overwhelming your immune system with that meal and everything else. So stress reduction is king. We've, at the genetic level, we see DNA repair and lengthening of your telomeres and all this miraculous genetic effect by just doing a moment of prayer, spiritual chant, song. These things all have been shown to kind of do this genomic regenerative effect. And so really cool that from stem cells to your genome, to your barrier systems of your gut, blood-brain barrier, and beyond, you're doing yourself a favor by that mindfulness moment of silence and pulling yourself out of your frenetic fight or flight state that you've been in through the day and your email list and everything else to chill.
Excellent. A good note to close on. Did you want to mention anything about the biology base camp? Is that somewhere where listeners could go to for some useful information around the subjects we've touched on today?
Sure, yeah. The website is intrinsichealthseries.com. The next one kicks off in the next 4 weeks or so. I think it might be the middle of October that next one launches. It's an 8-week program where you're paired one-on-one with an intrinsic health coach that's going to take you through the fundamentals of human biology. We're going to cover all the areas we've talked about today: nutrition, exercise, breathing, hydration, all these major sectors. And it's really the distillation of my last 10 years of life in the clinic as well as the basic science realm as to really understanding how does health happen. We're really good at understanding how diseases happen in Western medicine, but so little effort has been put into understanding how does biology happen? How does health really happen at the cellular level? And so that's what we delve into in that 8-week period. And so you got a one-on-one coach to understand all the material I'm covering with you. I'm doing 2-hour intensive seminars with you throughout the 8-week period. And so that information, then how does that really, take effect in your life? And so that's that 8-week program. So intrinsichealthseries.com on that one. For more just general education for free is the Zach Bush MD website, and Zach Bush, ZachBushMD.com. That's kind of where I try to put a lot of my thoughts into everything from reproductive health to exercise to some of these concepts in bullet points to delve in there, as well as kind of some of my daily thoughts. You can track me on social media there as kind of what am I seeing out inside the world and what are we talking about on the trail as we go from amazing lecture opportunity to another. Now it's really interesting. I get to speak to some of the most forward-thinking physician groups in the world, and I get to talk to some of the most forward-thinking consumer groups, mothers of autistic kids, all the way to kind of the high-end nutrition world, all the way to the farmers and what's going on in their environment. So I love exposing everybody to all of those dynamic conversations. So the social media, Instagram, Zach Bush MD there, and things like that. So Facebook as well. But you can just track on a million different levels. I'll book out to you by next year as well. That kind of encapsulates how did we get here and how do we get ourselves out of this. What does the last 150 years look like, and what does the next 150 years look like? That's the book there. So a lot to come at you, a lot to follow up with. And Nigel, I just so appreciate what you're doing for the world. Thank you all for participating in the podcast. I think this really is, the modern adaptation to community. When so few of us have the opportunity to build community in the day, this podcast environment has become an important place where we get human dialogue back into our life again, and especially in these long formats where you guys just heard over an hour conversation of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be healthy, what is the gut involved in there, and what is your relationship to that micro ecosystem that is a massive ecology outside of yourself. So I appreciate all of you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bush, and thank you, on behalf of the audience as well, for sharing all this wonderful information. So I do urge you all to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com, for any more information on how to thrive. Thank you all very much for listening, and do join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.